Evening, everyone, and thank you on behalf of the 11 members of our Fire Station Building Committee. We appreciate you joining us as we are excited to share a lot of information that's coming together quickly as we prepare to get these buildings rebuilt. We've been busy for quite some time, actually since our moderator Bob Hiss appointed us all in late 2017. Tonight is the second of two webinars. The first was a week ago tonight on the designs of the 3 fire stations. Tonight we'll focus on the budget details and the funding mechanism. And it's in a minute I'm going to be turn the presentation over to our Vice Chairman, very talented Vice Chairman Dan Clark, and he will go over the details in great depth on both these. But first, I want to just provide a brief overview of this atypical funding approach. Several years ago, approximately 6 years ago, then Select Board, led by Tom, I haven't seen you a moment, but the Select Board, thank you, Tom Hurley. They had recognized that the town was going to have to come to grips with rebuilding these fire stations. 2 of them are more than 100 years old. All 3 of them are in desperate need to be brought up to 21st century standards. And so recognizing that, they came up with an idea that since the town was paying debt for both the school building project and the library project, that rather than have the taxes start going down each year for maybe several years in a row, and then taking a big leap up to potentially deal with building the new fire stations, wouldn't it be good if we could just freeze it at a level tax level? And as the debt declined, sort of park that money while we got ready to start building the fire stations. Then when we did, we might be able to be in a position so that taxes would not increase to get these 3 fire stations built. Tonight, you're going to hear from Dan Clark that with a little extra help from some mechanisms that the town also had, we are going to potentially reach that goal of being able to build 3 new 21st century fire stations with no increase to the residents' taxes to get that done. So anyway, it's an exciting option. It's a little different. I wanted to kind of give you that overview. By the way, that was accomplished by, it wasn't just an action on the behalf of the Select Board. They had to use our state legislators, both reps and Senate. They had to submit special legislation. They had to receive the permission of town meeting. They get the town's approval. They had to go through that legislation through the state level, and it was approved. So it's a special legislation that is allowing Milton to do this, but it was very particular. It really was designed, it couldn't be used to then decide to build a new dog pound or something else. It had to be used for fire stations. And if they were going to do some building over at the DPW yard, they could do that as well. There are no plans to do anything currently at the DPW yard. So I just wanted to provide that overview. I want to thank you for your attendance. I also wanted to point out that we have our fire station, miltonfirestations.org website. And I would encourage you, if you haven't joined it, or even if you have, if you were to, and not during this webinar, of course, but if you go and click on that, go up in that, we have about an 8-minute video. We were very lucky. One of our members, Jean Sullivan, had a daughter, Amy Sullivan, that is a professional at putting together the videos. And we put together an 8-minute video that really helps you quickly understand the case that we have, the problems we have with the existing buildings, and the benefits of new buildings by showing you a recently completed project in the town of Needham nearby. Again, it's 8 minutes. It presents a good case of what we have that's not good and the benefits of going to a new fire station. So with that, I'm going to stop. We're going to have questions at the end, give you an opportunity to raise your hand, and we'll address those. But I'm going to stop and turn it over to Dan Clark. So go ahead, Dan.
Thanks, Brian. And just a reminder, for those that joined the webinar a week ago, you'll be familiar with this. There's a Q&A function within the Zoom if you're attending on a computer or a tablet. We really ask that you put your questions in there. We'll go through them at the end, answer them. We'll stay on as long as there's questions, and we'll try to get to those. And also a reminder that we also have the webinar Brian was talking about that was focused on design for the 3 stations that was presented last week. Recordings of that are available on the town's website, the Fire Station Building Committee website, which is miltonfirestations.org, and also on our Facebook page. There should be a link for that. So if you haven't seen that, I recommend that you go take a look. And if you have questions that aren't answered in there, or you don't have time to watch all the way through the questions to see if your question's in there, you can certainly reach out to Brian or I through miltonfirestations.org with any questions, and we'll either get back to you via email, or if it's a more in-depth conversation, we're happy to have those conversations. Better answer the questions now than at town meetings. So with that, tonight we're going to focus on financing and the budget. I'm going to do an overview, and then we'll get into the details of both how we're going to pay for this and also what the budgets look like and how we got there in the process. So just a reminder, people didn't attend last week's webinar. These are the current designs for the 3 fire stations and what they look like, and what we're spending this money on for these 3 stations. So the first thing I just wanted to explain is take a step back and really high level, big picture construction projects. What's involved, and there's 3 different cost categories. There's soft costs, which is anything that design fees, management, accounting, legal fees, loan interest. Basically anything that's not tangible and physical is a soft cost associated with the project. The vast majority of the soft costs were previously approved at a town meeting in the spring of 2018 for $2.7 million. And that was to pay for our design architect, all their engineering subs, in addition to an owner's project manager, which is a state requirement for any project over a certain cost threshold. And we're well beyond that. It's somewhere around, off the top of my head, I think it's $1 million and more. You're supposed to have an OPM, and we're certainly beyond that. So that was an initial soft cost. There's some soft costs that are incorporated into this budget that we're requesting at town meeting that weren't design services necessarily to design the building, testing services, other consultants that you need during construction. Some of those soft costs are built into this project budget that we're going to review tonight. And then there's hard costs, and that's everything inside the building, the physical, if it's permanent, it's a physical fixture, it's under this cost. And then, there's also FF&E, which is furnitures, fixtures, and equipment. So if you take the building and could tip it upside down and shake everything out of it, that would be the FF&E. This is a little bit of a nuance on a project like this where there's already an existing operation. The apparatus, the engines, the ladder trucks, a lot of the gear that the fire department already has is really excluded. So what we're talking about with FF&E is more the beds, the desks, the chairs, those types of things, the equipment that needs to go into the building, not necessarily the operational. There are some operational components, whether they're outdated or beyond their service life or no longer compliant, or the fire department just doesn't have them. There are some operational components being built into it. One example off the top of my head would be, extractor, a very special washing machine that really gets all the chemicals and carcinogens out of their equipment when they come back. We do have them now. They're undersized. They're starting to get older. So that's, an operational thing that's been incorporated to the budget. So we spent a lot of time going through that with previous Chief Grant and revising that with the new Chief Madden since he came on board in July of 2020. And then there's other costs. They don't really fall in either category. Typically that's land acquisition, is one of the big things that ends up in those categories. They don't really fit in there. So there's always some fringe other costs for projects when you're doing any new construction. So a project budget breakdown, just for education, is if you take a typical project, you're going to spend somewhere around 70% of that cost is the construction. How much does it cost to build it? How much does it cost to the labor, the materials, that's all going into that line item. And then there's 8% that's usually equipment, permanent stuff that's installed that we were talking about, systems, and then there's soft costs. So this is a typical breakdown that you see on projects. Obviously, certain types of buildings will skew these numbers differently. If it's a highly specialized building, such as a fire station, that's got a lot more nuance to it and a lot more design intensity behind it, those soft costs can sometimes creep up because it's more of a specialty design service that goes into it. But we're able to keep it right around that 10% number, which is industry standard. So as a committee, we're really proud of that. And then additionally, there's contingencies. Nothing ever goes perfect in construction. It's what I do for a living. I plan for it. I tell every new hire that starts with me that, that's the game. You're trying to limit risk, but you can never eliminate it 100%. So you always carry contingencies. And when you're in the design phase and you don't know exactly what the building is going to look like or the shape early on, conceptual feasibility, you put a larger contingency to that. And as you design it and get more detailed, your contingencies reduce in that design phase. And then the same thing happens with your construction contingencies and the cost estimate. As you get closer to that final finish line, those contingencies, you're taking the risk and the unknown factors out of the project and developing it more, that you're able to reduce those contingencies. So that's something that we do have built into this. We have a contingency that we're comfortable with, but we don't think is too aggressive, understanding that these projects have really been thought through. We've spent a lot of time thinking through this over the last 3.5, 4 years. So our budgeting process, we actually did 2 cost estimates. There's different steps throughout the process of doing design. And typically you do pre-schematic, schematic design, and you stop there and you do a budget estimate. And this was sent out by our owner's project manager, comes up with a number. Our architect sends it out, comes out with a number. And then they get together and they reconcile and go through it line by line and figure out why their numbers don't always match. And they don't. And they'll never match 100%. And they'll go through it and try to understand where the discrepancies are, why one estimator is looking at a line item at 2x and the other one's looking at it 3x. So they'll understand and they'll talk through that and they'll reconcile it, and the 2 parties will come together and generate one cost estimate. So that gets done first after schematic design. And that's really done early. As I said, it's big picture to kind of guide and understand what that cost is, and understand, is the building too expensive, or are we within what our hopes were for the budget? And, are there items that are considered extras that we can take out? So we really spent a lot of time going through that and driving the design of this budget, knowing that the town is in a blank checkbook. And we were really trying to balance that, providing the public safety component and keeping that in the forefront. And also knowing that these buildings are going to be done and probably have to last for the next 50 to 100 years for the town, based on history of how long our fire stations will last. Hopefully they get maintained better, but we know that they're going to be here for the long run. So we're balancing the cost and the future needs and the public safety. And you try to find that middle ground between all of these different factors that are pulling on the budget. After the schematic design, we then continue the design into design development. And at the end of design development, you send it out and you cost estimate it again. You have a lot more detailed plans, quantities are revised, the design is farther along, it's closer to the final product. So that was our process. We've gone through that a couple times now, and we feel really confident. And these are extremely detailed. Here's a couple examples of different pages from it. There's a summary, but it's line by line. You can see how much we're spending on demolition, how much we're spending on insulation and roofing, and every line item in the budget is understood and really scrutinized at the end of the day. So what we end up with after that is that process that I just talked about, is that yellow highlighted section I have. That's just the construction cost. Beyond just the construction cost, to get this total budget, we also need to talk about the FF&E. And similar process, our OPM, who does public safety buildings, is what they do, sits down with the chief and the fire department to understand what do they need for equipment, and runs through it. Our committee was able to bring it back and vet it to understand, are we going too crazy? Are we spending too much? Are we getting things we don't that we want but don't need? So there's a lot of checks and balances throughout that process. Additionally, there's a lot of miscellaneous costs built into this, hazardous materials that could come up. And we have, we do test samples to understand what those are. We do know that there's some hazardous materials to abate behind the Atherton Street. We've been able to incorporate those costs into the project. We know what temporary facilities might be needed. And that was a big thing that we've pushed as a committee, was trying to limit the need for temporary facilities. That's cost that the town is paying to rent temporary buildings that aren't going to have a long lifetime. It's not like we can keep them, they're rentals, and it's really throwing money out the window. So we really tried to design the stations in a way that it would limit what's needed there. And we were able to really accomplish that at headquarters. Relocating East Milton makes that a little easier for us. And we're able to limit that at Atherton by doing an addition renovation in a way that we can really keep that fire engine operational in that space for the large bulk majority of that construction window of roughly a year. So there's a lot of thought that went into this. And then there's obviously the administrative, the overhead costs, things like that for the OPM fees and managing the project, our architect being on site, the engineers still being involved through the whole construction project. So we're able to compile all those things, put a contingency in, and then also look at escalation. These are numbers in today's value, and we need to understand when are they going to happen. And this is something that's really difficult. You always err on the side of caution and go conservatively. The farther out you take a project, the less unknown there is. Is labor going to increase at the same rate? Is the Boston market going to be as hot as it is today in terms of construction? So this is, our best guess and our professional estimators' best guess. And, we carried contingent or escalations to certain values based on when these projects were going to go forward. And that also weighed into the order that we went into it. Atherton is the second most expensive. East Milton's a little bit cheaper. So that kind of weighed into our thinking of which one to do first, and limit the amount of escalation that's seen on that project to try to keep the cost down. So at the end of the day, when you bring all these numbers together, we end up with $32,250,000 for an allocation to go to the town to construct these buildings and equip them. So what does that look like in terms of cash flow? So we're able to analyze each station individually on a timeline and understand approximately how quickly is it going to happen, and then how fast are we going to spend money. And most construction projects are a pretty decent bell curve, where you have an increase, you peak out, and then it slowly dwindles down. So there's some nuances to that. Headquarters has multiple phases. It has different things happening at the beginning to prep the site with site site prep and moving a parking lot, building a new parking lot. And so there's some nuances to that that kind of shifted some of the money up front a little bit more compared to some of the others. So we were able to look at this timeline and really understand that cash flow to understand how can we afford to fit this within town budgets. An additional thing that we looked at after the CPA passed, Community Preservation Act, is a component of that is the historic. And we have a headquarters building, which is historic, in Atherton, which is significantly important and falls into that historic realm. And we were able to look at this with our OPM and our architect and pull out what we thought were reasonable historic components to request CPA funding for. We were able to come up with those numbers and kind of carry that forward as a line item for our funding, knowing that we think there's a high probability and a good merit for this type of project to go forward. I do want to touch on, looking at the numbers, what that actually means for the CPA. The CPA has the ability to generate a little over $800,000 conservatively. So we wouldn't go for all of the money at once. We would, because of headquarters being done first and then Atherton, it would make the most sense so that we're not taking up the bulk majority of that CPA money, so it can be spread across other projects. we'd probably apply for a CPA grant for headquarters first. When that project starts, wait a few years and then do the same thing for Atherton. So it would probably be conservatively somewhere on the 25 to 35% of the total money that the CPA could generate in 1 year. So we feel like it's a great project and a great reason to do it. We feel like we're not overextending or overreaching into the CPA funds and not allowing the CPA to be able to help the other causes that it's intended to help. So how are we going to pay for this? And Brian kind of touched on this earlier. We have this special funding mechanism that is the Special Purpose Stabilization Fund, Chapter 43 Home Rule Petition. And, we've talked about it so many times at our committee over the last 3.5 years. And this was the simplest way I could think of on how to explain it, which is you have the existing school and library debt in the blue line that over time, as principal and interest payments are coming down and we're nearing the end of the bond, the amount that the town owes is less. What the Special Purpose Stabilization Fund did is froze that in 2019 at the rate that we owed that, the principal and interest. We actually owe less, but we're still collecting at that rate. So the delta, that green area between these two lines, is what we're capturing. So we are collecting, for example, 2x, we owe 1x, that delta of 1 goes into the Special Purpose Stabilization Fund, and we're able to generate revenue. So it's what Brian is saying is not increase your taxes, it's flatlined it so that this money could go in there. And the thinking was, instead of having taxes go down and have it get to a point where it's less, and then all of a sudden have to start the process up and have a balloon way back up again, let's try to keep it as a level rate over time to lessen the burden on the taxpayers. So what this looks like is a schedule like this. In 2020, for example, the delta between those two numbers was $74,765. That's what was then deposited in. The next year, the amount goes up as the principal and interest goes down a little bit more. And you see that number increase each year. And in 2030, that's the year that the original bond for the school and library project would have been paid off in full. So we can't collect more than that ever. So it gets frozen at that number, and that goes in for each sequential year. And the legislation has really thought through all the nuances of this in terms of what happens in different scenarios. So if more money than is needed is put into this fund for our project, for example, that money goes back to the to offset the tax levy, operating budget, things like that. So there's some nuances and more detail in terms of exactly what that looks like, but this isn't a fund that can just generate money and sit there and not be used. And it can only be used for two things. The Special Purpose Stabilization Fund specifically calls out fire stations and a DPW yard project. So that's all it can be used for at this time. And so that's why we really think that, this is our best chance to fund the fire stations, and makes the most sense to take advantage of this to try to keep the burden kind of less. It's still, everybody's paying for it, but hopefully by keeping it flat, it's not as burdensome. So what that bond schedule looks like, we talked about that cash flow. We were able to take that cash flow and understand if we were going to bond it, how could we bond it to work with the schedule that I showed on the last slide of how much money we have in that fund. And so we were able to generate a bond schedule with Unibank. And basically the recommendation we got was to go with a method where you reduce the early principal payments so long as the total debt service has a faster than life issue, and then you do a level debt service. So what that schedule looks like is the blue chart shows the principal payments, and you can see those first few years, it's pretty small. And then it builds up and it stays pretty level throughout the course of that bond until the end. And then you see the interest staying pretty level. So the gray area, excuse me, is principal and interest combined. So you can see how that ramps up, stays fairly level. And the spikes that you see here, are from those bond schedules being issued of 2022, 24, and 26 that you can see through there. So And then what that means for us is, how does this work within the Special Stabilization Fund? And this is a big chart to look at, but the first column is fiscal year, and it's split into two just so you can see it a little easier. This fiscal year runs through 2056, and the amount issued column is, new bond being issued. And there's some notes in here where we're taking out short-term notes before we're actually issuing bonds to kind of help bring us along. And when you issue a note, you're paying interest only and not principal. So it's really taking us along. And the whole reason for that is the first few years of the Special Purpose Stabilization Fund doesn't generate the kind of base that we need to be able to bond stuff immediately. So we're trying to strike a balance here of getting to those later years that the stabilization fund has large deposits going into it, but not delaying the project that we're waiting 5 years to actually start these projects, knowing that it's a 5-year construction schedule for all 3 stations. So there was a balance to be struck there. A lot of thought went into this. There was numerous iterations of this and moving of money to try to make this make sense. And I did want to highlight 3 items in this chart, which was when we presented this to the Capital Improvement Planning Committee, the Warrant Committee, and the Select Board, we made aware that, as Brian hinted at the beginning, the Special Purpose Stabilization Fund comes just short of doing it on its own. And there's a couple things that we need to help push it over the edge to get there without delaying the project further. And that would be the Select Board and Capital Improvement Planning Committee set aside $600,000 into a stabilization fund in case the Fire Station Building Committee, who was spending money on design fees, never got to a construction project, and we couldn't bond that design fee that we've been spending to do the designs over a longer period with the construction project. And so they set aside $600,000 as kind of a safety net. And we proposed to the Select Board and Capital Improvement Planning Committee that we transfer 405 of that 600 into this project, knowing that if this project is approved and it goes forward, there's no longer that risk of the design funds not being bonded with the full construction project. Secondly, I'd mentioned the CPA grant money, and we showed that as long as both of those grants would be approved by 2025 and deposited into the account, that also helps make this work. And where this comes from is this last category, or this last column, is the stabilization fund balance. And what that is how much has been put into it today minus the principal and interest that's paid. And as you follow this down, you can see that there's some years that it gets smaller. And later on, it was all these nuances were done because the stabilization fund can never go negative. It has to stay at least $1. And you can see in 2043, it's when it gets to its lowest. It's still positive. So the funding mechanism works. And then the last thing I wanted to note was that in 2053, if there's no other projects, if the DPW project doesn't come on board and nothing else is going to happen with fire stations, that would be the last year that delta would be deposited between what we owed and what was being tax levied. So we're basically asking the taxpayers to fund this from 2019 to 2053. It's a long period of time, obviously, but that's what it's stretched out to try to minimize the cost and the impact and make it work within this funding mechanism. So with that, I'm sure there are questions. I'm happy to take them. I do know that we have the chair of the Capital Improvement Planning Committee with us in case there's any questions that should be directed there. So I'll just open up this, Mr. Hiss. Sounds like you're requesting to tap into CPA annual funds without bonding against future CPA funds. Is that right? That was the current thought, that could be an option to bond against it. But we were treating it as a grant and a deposit into the stabilization fund. So hopefully that answers your question, Mr. Hiss. If not, you can certainly type in again and I'll try to follow it up best I can. Joe Curran says, last week I asked a question if the traffic light proposed at the East Milton station is addition to the one approved at town meeting a few years ago at Adams and West Quantum. Mr. Walsh thought I was asking about traffic improvements in East Milton Square, and I was not. To clarify, I'm asking if the fire committee is proposing a second traffic signal in the area that has none, but scheduled for one soon, maybe two. So the answer to that question is, in front of this station that you can see down here at the right, the East Milton station, the idea would be, and it's not definitive at this point because it's not fully designed, but the thinking and our architect and the civil engineer working on the project with us are confident that the direction to take it is to, in front of that station, to have an emergency light. So it's a light that would only be operational when the fire department needs it. When they come out, they have a button that activates it. You see these over in Quincy. There's some in Boston where it will communicate to the two lights, the one that's going in at West Quantum, the lights down in East Milton. It'll turn those red and it'll flash emergency, letting people know that the fire engine's coming out or parking. So hopefully that answers your question and clears up that, Mr. Curran. Mr. Tangney, what if CPA funds are smaller? So the CPA funds, there's two components to it. There is the amount that comes through a surcharge to the town, and that's a pretty well-known amount based on what the tax base is because it's a surcharge. There's some unknown to it, not knowing how many people are exempt for it based on income levels. But the town has a pretty good estimate of what it's going to be at. And that's the bulk majority of it. There are state matching funds that range year to year between 10 and 20% typically, I believe. So I don't believe that there's a risk for the CPA funds fund out there to be too small that it can't accommodate a project like this. How does this work with plans for a new school? So that's certainly a very big question. I can't be the only person to answer that question, but certainly with this funding mechanism and having this unique ability of us using this funding mechanism, the town does have the ability to bond other projects. And I think Mr. Wells is on, and I'm going to promote him because as Capital Improvement Planning Committee Chair, I think it would be most appropriate for Mr. Wells to answer this question. So let me promote Mr. Wells. And Mr. Wells is also our liaison on from the select board to our committee. Richard, are you available to answer that question?
Yeah, good evening. How are you? Can you just repeat the question, Dan? Just what was the question?
How does this work with the plans for a new school? And I assume that the question was regarding funding.
So with regard to the select board, the school hasn't reached us yet. As chair of the Capital Improvement Planning Committee, all capital projects come to us initially. They're in the discussion phase. They're nowhere near, they haven't got to a site location or a dollar amount. I do know that, as you stated, we are in a really, and it's why the Capital Committee gave this a heartfelt, unanimous vote of approval, because we're in such a unique opportunity here to be able to build 3 brand new state-of-the-art, badly needed fire stations without asking the taxpayers for an additional dollar. And so we, from the Capital Committee, we do know that this project will be coming, the school project will be coming to us. We're preparing for it. There are a lot of, a lot of things I can't answer now because we don't know what the site is yet. We don't know what the cost is. We don't know how much school building project will refund the time. There was, 90% 15 years ago. We don't anticipate it that much, but we're looking hopefully at like 35%, something around there between 35 and 45. That would be good. But we're prepared for that. Bonding is something that we do every year. We just bonded again last week. So it's not something that we're truly concerned about. We understand things of this magnitude, both the fire station and potentially a new elementary school are, serious things that you have to give a lot of weight and thought to, as you articulate in your own presentation tonight on this project. So I hope I answered that. I hope it's just so preliminary. I don't think it's going to harm us, but we are preparing for it. We're preparing that this will be, we've got placeholders on our radar screen for it, but just it has not all arrived at our doorstep yet. So I don't want to speak prematurely.
Thank you, Richard. I think that answers the question. Mary Kelly asked the question, are the detailed budgets and tax rate impact details found on the website? So the detailed budgets are on the website, on our website, miltonfirestations.org. As soon as you get to the home page, there's a section, recent documents, right in the middle that has a budget. That'll show you the budget, the overall budgets I shared. You can dive into the line by line items. The tax rate impact details aren't in that, but I can share, I can pull together some of that information and I'll go back and Mary, if this isn't what you're looking for, I can share a more detailed version of this funding mechanism and the stabilization fund chart, this bond schedule, and also the full version of this funding mechanism. So if there was something else you're looking for, you can certainly reach out to Mr. Walsh or myself. Frank Schroth asked, are there aspects to the design and the construction, number of bays that might impose higher annual operating costs going forward? Are there still aspects of the design that are unresolved? And if so, what impact might they have on this budget? Great questions. Early on in my career, I was taught by one of my mentors that when you get through the design development phase, you really do have an understanding of what the project is. It's getting it to that level, going from design development to construction documents and bidding documents, that you are taking the documents and giving really more detailed information that somebody can hold up the plans and construct it, and that it's fully understandable. So we have a good idea of what the costs are, and we feel confident in there. I wouldn't say that there are unresolved changes that could arise. It's more minimal, and those things would be captured as we're still in the design phase to go from design development to CD. We still have a design contingency built into this number, knowing that not every little thing has been figured out and accounted for. So you are able to capture any of those changes or nuances within the design contingency, or should be able to, at least, if we've done our job right. And the aspects of the number of bays, there's certainly, with these being larger buildings, certainly will be, additional operating costs. It's a really hard analysis and a lot of money to really do an energy analysis to really dive into what those impacts might be. But our committee made a lot of decisions with regard to sustainability through our owner's project requirements that we outlined at the last webinar, to really make decisions to try to help offset that. These are more energy efficient fire stations than the national average and the industry standard. And we're making those decisions to try to make it less burdensome on the operating costs. Additionally, we've made decisions on systems that should last longer and be able to give longer life into some of the systems and not have to require maintenance for a period of time. And then additionally, a lot of the new construction, this new building is better insulated, more energy efficient than the previous building. So while it may be bigger, the delta shouldn't be, because it's a building that's 2 times as big, the operating budget shouldn't go and double. It really should be a smaller increase that we should be able to see. Ms. Tagayas, I recognize this question may have been better suited for last week, but can you explain how you arrived at 5 bays for the central station when the existing has 2? Great question, Cheryl. I'm happy to answer it. That really came out of what we talked about last week in the webinar. Jeff Shaw, our architect from Context, went through the starting point for these projects were to work with the fire department and the chief, and it was vetted through our committee to create a program, which is a line by line item of everything that the fire station needs. What do they need for, number of beds and how many people are working there? And we're also projecting into the future of what's there. So while there's currently 2 bays there, there's also an engine from East Milton that's currently the spare engine that would be relocated to headquarters. So that immediately takes you from 2 to 3. And additionally, there's some other apparatus that would take up that 4th bay that would be relocated from Atherton. I know that the chief's current plans is to probably bring the brush truck and the boat to headquarters. But exactly what happens is operational in my mind. We've worked with the fire department to know how much square footage they need for, beds and apparatus. And that's, the balance that we found, which is what do they need? What do we really think long-term they're going to need, but not, going above and beyond and going frivolous with the design. Additionally, the last bay was for housing 2 ambulances that would be, we understand through the select board and our liaison that would be currently, housing a outside ambulance service at the headquarters. So it's really outside of our committee in terms of those mechanisms. In terms of the ambulance piece of it, we incorporated it based on feedback that we got and a need. But that's really how we ended up with the 5 stations. And if you go, you can find the programs on our website and you can look at it. If you can't find it, reach out to me. I can share the programs with you directly and you can kind of see how we ended up at these numbers. Ms. Powers, you have provided a plan to cover the capital costs that does not include raising taxes. What about the increase for operating costs for the new station? Now a lease payment for the land of East Milton proposed site. Also, what if town meeting members do not vote to allow the CPA funds to cover this 25%? Certainly, well, just one correction on the question. The CPA funds aren't covering 25% of the cost. My reference to the 25% was our request would be approximately 25% of a single year's CPA funding revenue. So that was what I meant by the 25%. If for some reason our grant wasn't approved by the committee and town meeting, it would be required by the select board and capital improvement planning committee to find another source through free cash or other means to be able to generate that so that money goes into special purpose stabilization fund. So that's a bridge we would certainly have to cross with the capital improvement planning committee and select board. But the items that we pulled out as historic, we pulled them out. We could probably find some more potentially to include, but we thought they were really merit-based and had a lot of reason to go forward and get approval by the CPA. So we have a really high confidence that that would be approved. And I think I touched base on the operating costs, and I'm not going to touch base on the lease payment because that's really outside the purview of the fire station building committee. That was a recommendation to go to that site that our committee made to the select board, and we passed that off. That's currently with the select board in their court. So, given I wouldn't get into that too much, but I hope I answered your question previously on capital costs. Mr. Hiss, CPI inflation is running below 2%. The inflation rate I saw on the sheet showed 3, 6, and 12% in 3 years of construction. What is the basis for modeling the higher inflation rates than CPI? So the consumer price index and escalation in construction usually don't trend together. And also, while CPI inflation is that today, we really want to be conservative with those escalation numbers, knowing that if all of a sudden in this current administration, there is a lot of federally funded projects for infrastructure, that's going to very rapidly within the industry create pricing and escalation to go back up. So we wanted to really be conservative with that number with the hopes that hopefully it's not needed, but we wanted to build it in as a safety net And if we don't need it and we can return money back to the town and use less of this budget, we certainly will. We're asking for, a maximum amount of $32,250,000. But there's nothing to say that we can't spend less. We're trying to do this in a way where we're coming and asking money one time, and we're not coming back in 2-3 years from now and say, well, construction costs got out of control. We didn't see it coming. We need more money before we can move forward. We really are trying to be smart about this and come and go through this process one time. Mr. Hess, 2 contingencies in the estimate. Are they additive so that they're total? Yeah, the 2 contingencies, there's a design contingency currently because we're still in that design phase. And then the other contingency is for construction. So hopefully we don't need that design contingency. What will happen is when the project is ready to go to bid, that design to contingency will turn into a 0 in the line item. And if there's money that we don't think we need anymore, that's money that we can kind of have as additional contingency in the construction, or we can reduce the amount of money that the project may see. Mr. Coyle, how does a newly planned community preservation committee fit in the funding process? What about competition for CPA funds versus fire stations? So the funds for the Community Preservation Act will be funded through 2 things. One, a surcharge that is a line item on your tax bill, and then also through state matching funds. So they're not really, in my mind, competing interests, but something that is a benefit to us. And I certainly think that there's competition for these CPA funds. There's certainly a lot of things in town that are happening that would qualify it. I think ours is a really good use of these funds, but also, we're ready to do this now. With CPA funds, you want to be able to, have projects that are ready. I think some of the other projects that may be competing for these funds may not be ready to start immediately. So, that's my assumption. I could be wrong, but I think that a committee would be highly likely to approve this.
Hey, Dan, it's Brian. I don't know if you can hear me. It looks like Richard might want to weigh in on this.
I do, Brian. Thank you. When Dan's ready, when he's ready.
Do you want me to go through the rest of the questions, Richard, or do you want to jump in now?
I just wanted to comment on the one question about the CPA funds. Two things about the CPA were, much of the effort in securing the affirmative vote to pass CPA for our community was the fact that we were going to be able to use CPA funds towards the 2 historic buildings, Engine 4 and headquarters. And the second thing about your project is you just alluded to for a moment, Dan, is you're probably going to be the first shovel-ready project that the CPA committee will deal with in the next couple of years. So it's really a win-win. We're very fortunate this happened, but it's the work of your committee and this fire station project and the fact that you've done so much to preserve the historic nature of headquarters and Engine 4 that is what makes you eligible for those CPA funds. And I think that there will be a great deal of support. I don't want to speak for all of our board, but I believe there'll be a lot of support in our board as well as other boards for that. Thank you, Brian. Thanks, Dan. That's it.
So a couple more questions. Brian Kelly asked, I see an expense for 3 gyms. Could there be one new one built in existing old headquarters shared by all firefighters? This would also reduce space requirements for each of the stations. I believe local gyms give first responders discounted memberships. So this is something that our committee went in at length. Several of our members really questioned the need for this at all in any station. And there was a lot of dialogue back and forth. And it wasn't something solved in one meeting. There was a lot of dialogue over, probably a 2-year period, because Chief Grant talked about this and Chief Madden really weighed in on a lot before, our committee finally really coming together and understanding it. And it was really explained to us that Chief Madden explained it really well, which was his department, when their staff, when the firefighters are on duty, they're responding to all sorts of things. And a lot of them are trauma, and a lot of them are nothing anybody should have to witness or see, let alone respond to. And there have been a lot of studies within the fire department industry, or within fire departments, that they're not really gyms anymore. You have to think of them as wellness centers. And when a firefighter is responding to something tragic like that, it may stress them out. They may be carrying a burden. And there have been studies showing that having more of a wellness center and having something in the facility, so that when they come back from a call, for example, and they need to release some stress because of seeing some trauma, having that type of facility in the building is better than waiting a day or two. We have to remember, you run 24-hour shifts at our department. These men and women are there for 24 hours living. And, I think everybody that's gone to a work from home environment over the last year, you look at how many people have added home gyms and, changed their living arrangements because of being home 24/7 almost. And, that's how we have to really think about these. I think it would be short-sighted on our part to take that out of each of the stations. And I saw it firsthand. I visited each station when I joined this committee to get to understand the operations, to get to understand the men and women that are on this department and understand their needs. And every time I went to a station, there was somebody working out at one of these gyms, or makeshift gyms. I mean, East Milton has their equipment behind the engine. So I really think we have to think beyond them. And in my mind, and I think most of my committee members would really join me in saying that several of us are really shown the reason why they need to be in these stations, and really why it would be short-sighted to not have them within the station. Mr. Kelly, if you have to follow up on that more, I highly encourage you to reach out to the chief. He'll be more than happy to talk to you about that in more detail. It's something that he was, very passionate about and really explained really well to our committee. Mike, with many 40B projects being proposed around town, has there been consideration for the need of growth in the fire department to better serve the growth in population in the town? I've noticed there is only an addition of 1 or 2 bays. Is there a need for more than that in the future? So that's a great question. I think that in terms of our stations, that was something we looked at when our committee very early on looked at, can we reduce to 2 stations and go to a 2-station model versus a 3? And one of the big drivers for that was, at the time, we would meet the National Fire Protection Association's requirement of, recommendation requirement standard for meeting 90% of homes in town within 4-minute runtime or less. We were just at that, but and this was, even before 40Bs really got off and going like they are today. We understood that the town is still growing. There's pockets that can grow. And a lot of the areas that wouldn't be covered in that 4 minutes, or were on the fringes of that 4 minutes, are some of the areas that are more likely to see growth and development. So that was one of the big drivers for our committee deciding to stick with the 3 stations. And I think that took into consideration. I think the biggest question with the 40B projects is not that, you have them going in with regard to the fire department. I think the biggest question would be the size of them and if a future ladder truck would be needed. That's something that's very long thinking, but there is some flex space built into these stations that some equipment can be moved around and allow for that potential growth. And I think we feel pretty confident that these stations, the way that they're spaced right now, would really work for the town over the long term. Mr. Coyle, what about a 6-story 40B project's impact on equipment? So I would defer to, I'm going to see if he is on. Is Chief Madden on? I see a Chris, but I'm not 100% confident. Chief Madden, is that you on the line? No, it was unfortunately another Chris. So I would defer to Chief Matt on this, but from my understanding, the existing ladder truck does have the ability to service a 6-story building. But I'm certainly not 100% confident not being on the fire department. So highly recommend following up with Chief Madden on that question. Ms. Ann Davis, does the funding depend on the sale of East Milton property? There is a shortage of town-owned property, and any future sales of the property might require careful planning. So we have not included any sale of the East Milton property, those funds being deposited into the Special Purpose Stabilization Fund. And we did that for one important reason. Nothing says that the select board has to sell that. When the fire department moves out, it would be deemed surplus. The select board could deem it surplus and choose to do something with it. What that might look like, I think, is unknown, given that it's the last station. Therefore, we weren't anticipating that there would be a sale. There's a lot of options the select board could do. They could hold it, they could rent it, they could solicit an RFP for 99-year lease, purchase, redevelopment. It's really unknown. So I think it was in our best interest to not anticipate receiving proceeds from a sale or lease of the East Milton station. And I think this might be our last question, Ms. Connor. How much does LEED certification for energy conservation in the stations impact the total cost and the timeline for that return on investment? Also, are there any rebate programs from the utility companies in a project such as this? I'm going to answer. I'm actually going to let, if he's willing, Mr. Shaw, our architect, who I know is on, answer this question if he's still with us.
Brian. Hi, Dan.
Hi, Jeff.
I'm excited to be able to get to speak at the end of this thing. So most of you may have been to the session last week where we discussed the design of the facilities and talked about many different aspects of them. One of the things we just didn't get a whole lot of time to discuss is the sustainability aspects. We did have a slide that went over the features of the building, but a lot of work has gone into, and I should say a lot of talent on the town's end, sitting on the building committee, specializing in architectural design that's sustainable, as well as really good sustainable features. We're driving the desire of the committee. And as Dan mentioned earlier, we had an entire document created by the town that had project requirements that the town would like to achieve in all 3 facilities. One of which is to achieve LEED certification. And these days, the question specifically was about LEED Silver, but these days, LEED Silver is a fairly pretty good hurdle to jump over, and for most projects, not considerably difficult for most projects that have an intention to be sustainable on the whole, and not going to add a whole lot of cost. Actually, the studies that we've seen, there's a very minimal amount of cost. Most of the cost is in the administration fees to handle the paperwork to get the certification. There's really no impact to the construction costs because the industry has been driven by the sustainability movement and has been able to sort of as a market force push the sustainability into all the products and into all the techniques, into all of the recycling components and other elements of construction that have allowed projects to really take advantage of it and not have to pay these extra costs. So most contractors are familiar with LEED, most contractors are able to achieve it, and most designs are able to achieve it. And that's what we've done here. We've identified all of the requirements to get there, and they've been included in the project budgets. And as I said, really have not impacted those at this point. So the town will have the choice in the future whether they do want to pursue LEED certification, which I believe is the intention. And in terms of overall payback for these things, I mean, many of them are really dealing with the welfare of the individuals living in the building. And that's been a huge focus of the design as well, making sure that the firefighters living and working on these buildings have comfortable, safe environments that are healthy. And so a lot of the materials, the choices for materials, as well as the design of the systems and components going into the buildings have really been focused on that. So terms of payback, there's not really a direct payback for those things. I think the payback is in the ability to retain staff, the ability for people to be very excited to come to Milton and work in the fire department, and to really have a pride and purpose in their jobs here. So I think that's a really great aspect that the town should be proud of. We are planning to do photovoltaics at all three stations, and those would have obviously an energy mitigating function. We'd be able to spend less money on operating costs, and the buildings themselves are designed to be to not use any fossil fuels, so that the town has some choices as to where they buy their power from. In addition to the solar panels, could buy it from renewable resources, and that way really be a sustainable leader in the Commonwealth. So hopefully that answers your question. I probably went into way too much detail, but I appreciate the option to answer.
One point of clarification to Jeff's comment, he had mentioned that a lot of the cost is administrative to actually get that LEED certification. Our this project is LEED certifiable, but we've made the decision to not actually get the certification and get the plaque for the building, because we thought that spending the money on the administrative piece of it to get the plaque wasn't money well spent. So we decided to design the station in a way that if somebody was to pay for that paperwork, we would meet that threshold. But we thought it was better to spend that money on other components of the project. So I don't see any other questions. Thank you everybody for joining. I really appreciate everybody's attendance and your questions. Helpful. You can certainly get in touch with myself or Brian if you have any questions. Webinar, either webinar, or if you don't have time to watch the webinar and you have a question, happy to take that question, and get back to you, via email or phone, if whatever is best for you. I'd like to thank.
Dan, if I could, I think you're going to go ahead and thank Milton Access, but if I could too, I just want to put another plug in for everyone that's spent this amount of time, whether it's on both webinars or one, to take the time to go up to miltonfirestations.org. They can explore more detail, but to watch that 8-minute video, I think they'll find it well worth the time. Thank you. Go ahead, Dan. You got to.
That's it. The last question was just thank you from Brian Kelly. So thank you, everybody, and hopefully we'll see some of you at town meeting.
A quick question. Are you there? Are you still there? Dan?
One second, Richard. Hold on, Richard. 1 second.
Is Brian still on? Is Brian still here?
Brian's still on. Yep.
Yep.
Mike,
Okay.
Richard, I'll call you and Brian, and we'll just link up on there.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. All right.